Hey guys, tonight we're going to gently drift into the curiously complex history of two nations who decided a truly excellent holiday should happen on different days. You're settling in now. Maybe you've got that perfect, weighted blanket tucked around you. The kind that feels like a friendly, insistent hug from a very heavy Labrador. And you can already hear the low, comforting whir of the fan blades turning lazily above you. The air in the room is starting to cool. The shadows are stretching, and you're anticipating that deep, satisfying mental fog that comes just before sleep takes hold. Now imagine you're back in the vast, untamed woodlands of early North America. It's a place where the seasons dictate everything, where surviving winter is less an achievement and more a furious, year-long negotiation with Mother Nature. Every harvest, every successful gathering of stores, every moment the community realized they hadn't, completely starved yet, was a cause for spontaneous, profound relief. We're talking about initial feasts, a continent's unscripted meal, where the very concept of formalized gratitude was still just a raw, natural impulse, not a calendar event. You probably won't survive this deep dive into conflicting colonial dates, but try to stay awake for the sheer, delightful boredom of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below, so we can all share a moment of collective, sleepy geographical awareness. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the rough, homespun wool of your doublet against your skin as you trudge through the late autumn fields. The ground is cold, damp, and gives slightly with every exhausted step you take. You're not thinking about a holiday. You're thinking about calories. You're thinking about the heavy sacks of dried corn, the smoked venison, and the preserved squash that represent the slender thread between life and the extremely permanent sleep of a New England winter. This vast continental landscape, long before it was carved up by international boundary lines or holiday proclamations, hosted countless acts of harvest gratitude. These weren't organized, national events. They were simply initial feasts, a continent's unscripted meal. You could find similar gatherings happening from the fertile, abundant valleys of the Iroquois Confederacy, where the green corn ceremony marked a crucial point in the agricultural cycle and lasted for days with complex ritual and social meaning, to the small, fragile outposts of European settlers all along the Atlantic coast. Every single community, indigenous or newly arrived, knew that the year was a tightrope walk, and the successful filling of the winter stores warranted a collective, enormous sigh of relief expressed through food. This is your first mainstream historical fact. Long before the Pilgrims, indigenous nations across the continent, such as the Cherokee Creek and Iroquois, regularly observed intricate, spiritual, and communal harvest ceremonies that shared the core theme of seasonal Thanksgiving. These feasts were essential to the social and religious fabric, often involving more than just a quick meal. They were multi-day affairs focused on cleansing renewal and deep, respectful engagement with the natural world that sustained them. The European arrivals brought their own, slightly less nature-centric, but equally earnest, traditions of feasting. You have to remember that in Europe, days of Thanksgiving were proclaimed quite spontaneously. A local governor might declare a day of fasting and prayer when the crops failed, or a day of feasting and gratitude when a military victory was secured, or a ship full of crucial supplies finally made it past the dangerous Atlantic crossing. These were fluid, religious, and political tools, not rigid calendar appointments. They were event-driven, which, let's be honest, makes a lot more sense than blocking out a specific Thursday months in advance. Imagine declaring a national day of gratitude because your internet connection has been stable for a full week. A glorious, justified celebration, but probably not one that will happen on the same date next year. That, essentially, is the environment you are walking through in your heavy wool coat. Every small, successful community was a sovereign entity when it came to their calendar of gratitude. Think about the Spanish presence down in Florida, far from the chilly northeastern woods. As early as 1565, when the Spanish founded St. Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited European, established settlement in the continental U.S., they had a religious mass followed by a communal meal. This meal, according to records, included salted pork, ship's biscuit, garbanzo beans, and a wine ration. Crucially, they shared this meal with the local Timucua people. Now, that's a party with a very different menu than the one you've been mentally rehearsing, involving turkey and cranberry sauce, and it's a quirky or fringe tidbit that completely throws a wrench into the narrative. Was that the first Thanksgiving? Well, it was a day of thanks followed by a shared meal on North American soil. The celebration in St. Augustine occurred a full 56 years before the more famous event you're likely already drifting off thinking about. However, because the historical emphasis was on the Mass, the religious act of thanksgiving, and the meal was simply a nice, social outcome, it never gained the cultural traction of the later event. It's a great example of how the narrative of a holiday is less about chronological order and more about who was around to write the most compelling and politically useful version of the story later. The Spanish weren't trying to create a national mythos about religious freedom in the same way the English speaking colonies would later need to. They were just, existing. You might argue that the very earliest European Thanksgiving observance on the continent could go back even further to the 1541 expedition led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in the Texas Panhandle. His priests held a day of thanksgiving in a remote canyon, giving thanks for the discovery of water and the sustenance they needed to continue their search for the mythical 7 cities of gold. No pumpkin pie was involved. It was a desperate, immediate, and solemn moment of religious relief. But, again, these events were isolated, specific to the mission or expedition, and they didn't plant the seeds of a recurring civic holiday. The land itself was constantly witnessing these acts of seasonal or survival-based gratitude, a continuous stream of minor, local thanksgivings that only a historian with an incredibly niche blog post would ever catalog. As you walk through the emerging colonial landscape, you start to see the fundamental difference between the northern and southern colonies. A difference that will subtly shape the 2 separate national traditions we're tracing tonight. In the colder, stricter, more religiously intense northern settlements, particularly those established by the Puritans and Pilgrims, a day of thanksgiving often took the form of intense religious observation. We're talking hours of prayer, sermons that could test the endurance of a marathon runner, and strict adherence to religious doctrine. The feasting, while present, was often secondary to the spiritual purpose. It was a solemn, God-focused event. In the southern colonies, particularly in Virginia, the celebrations tended to be less focused on religious austerity and more on community, building, general prosperity, and, let's be honest, having a good party. Their Thanksgivings were often tied to successful arrivals or the cessation of conflict with local indigenous groups, like the well-documented observance in 1619 at the Berkeley 100 in Virginia. This event, where 38 settlers arrived and held a service proclaiming a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God, is yet another claimant for the title of First Thanksgiving. The order given by the ship's owner was explicit. We ordain that the day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for Planticon in the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God. Note the word perpetually. They intended for it to be an annual event. So, here you are, standing on the North American shore in the early 17th century, and the only thing abundant is confusion about which first Thanksgiving you're supposed to be celebrating. You've got Spanish claims, Virginian claims, and soon you'll have the famous Massachusetts claim. This multiplicity underscores a crucial point for understanding the holiday's later split. The custom wasn't delivered fully formed on a silver platter. It emerged as a scattered, geographically inconsistent cultural practice. You could move 50 miles up the coast and find a completely different date and reason for a local Thanksgiving celebration. The very idea that a whole continent would eventually agree on the same Thursday in the same month is, frankly, hilarious given the initial chaos. It's like trying to get every single person in a large family to agree on one streaming service. It's just not going to happen. This brings us to one of the most persistent issues historians still argue about when it comes to the early colonial period. Historians still argue whether these earliest, isolated colonial Thanksgivings were genuinely unique, spontaneous religious observances, or simply a continuation of established English harvest festival traditions, rebranded with a heavier religious emphasis to suit the Puritan ethos. Was it genuinely a groundbreaking American moment, or was it just a standard English harvest home feast dressed up in a slightly stiffer, more judgmental new world costume? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle, but the intensity of the debate shows you just how slippery the origins of any major national tradition can be. The people at the time weren't thinking, "Gosh, I should document this feast meticulously so future generations can establish a national holiday and argue about its provenance." They were thinking, "Thank goodness we have enough food to survive the next 5 months." The primary source material is often frustratingly vague about the specifics of the meals, the guest lists, or even the exact dates. We have to piece together a coherent narrative from scant and often biased accounts, usually written by people who had a vested interest in promoting the image of their particular settlement as the model of piety and success. As you look around at the sparse, cold beauty of the autumn landscape, you realize that the unifying element across all these disparate celebrations, Spanish, English, indigenous, was the profound, existential relief that came with a successful harvest in a hostile environment. It was a moment where the anxiety of survival was briefly, blessedly suspended. They weren't celebrating a national identity. They were celebrating biological persistence. They were celebrating the fact that the soil, the water, and the sun had cooperated one more time, and that their collective human effort had not been in vain. That shared, fundamental, non-political impulse of gratitude is what all the later, more formal, and politically charged national holidays would be built upon. But, for now in this initial stage, the holiday is entirely local. It is a tiny, flickering flame of relief in a vast, dark wilderness, and it is observed on 1,000 different days for 1,000 different reasons. The continent is littered with these small, forgotten acts of thanksgiving. The next major step, the one that everyone remembers, is the one that managed to capture the imaginations of writers centuries later, even though it was arguably just as unscripted and casual as all the others. You're shivering slightly now, feeling the crispness of the air and smelling the faint, smoky scent of cooking fires nearby. You know you're about to move north and forward in time, toward the famous 1621 event. But first, you have to acknowledge the foundational truth. The ground you stand on is already saturated with the forgotten, spontaneous gratitude of countless communities, long before any government ever tried to control the calendar. This groundwork of decentralized, regional, and entirely voluntary feasting will make the later attempts at national standardization an exercise in supreme historical and political patience, one that would take centuries to resolve and ultimately fail to unify the two nations that would eventually emerge. The history of the holiday is not a straight line. It's a messy, tangled knot of forgotten feasts, political opportunism, and genuine, heartfelt relief. You realize you've been standing here too long, your feet growing numb, and it's time to move toward the next, more famous, but also deeply flawed, celebratory moment. You leave the quiet field, the ghosts of unscripted meals fading behind you, heading now for the chilly shores of Plymouth. The weight of the world's gratitude, it turns out, is heavier and more scattered than you ever imagined. You now find yourself shivering on the edge of what will become an American legend, a place so heavy with inherited cultural meaning that the actual events that happened here struggle to breathe under the weight of myth. Plymouth, 1621. This section is all about the Pilgrim's first day misdated, misunderstood gratitude. You're walking among the surviving pilgrims, who are less the stoic, black, hatted figures of modern children's books, and more a collection of utterly exhausted, spiritually driven, and deeply relieved individuals who have barely survived their first year. They landed in December 1620, suffered through the brutal general sickness, which wiped out nearly half their number, and by the autumn of 1621, they had a small, fragile foothold. The famous gathering, the one you're supposed to be thinking about when you see cartoon turkeys, was less a deliberate act of founding a holiday and more a spontaneous overflow of successful co-existence. A party that simply got a little bigger than expected. The most crucial, most overlooked detail about this celebrated event is this: the people involved didn't call it Thanksgiving. In their rigid, religious worldview, a true, proclaimed Thanksgiving was a solemn, fasting, heavy day of prayer decreed by the governor in response to a specific, usually miraculous, divine intervention, Say, rain finally arriving after a severe drought, or a military threat miraculously evaporating. The famous 1621 event, which lasted for 3 days, was described by attendee Edward Winslow as a rejoicing or harvest feast. It was a moment of secular, community celebration of material success, not a formal religious holy day. You can picture Governor William Bradford, the central figure in this fragile colony, likely trying to keep the Puritan elements focused on solemn gratitude, while the general population was just thrilled to have successfully filled the meager storehouses. This casual, unscripted nature of the 1621 gathering is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. The 1621 Plymouth Gathering was a 3-day, non-religious harvest festival, not the religiously prescribed day of Thanksgiving they would later observe in other years. It was an instance of communal joy that simply happened, not a tradition they deliberately established. You can smell the smoke of the cooking pits and hear the boisterous, rough-hewn sounds of a frontier party. This wasn't a tidy, well-mannered dinner. The Pilgrims invited Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag people, who showed up with 90 of his men. Imagine hosting a dinner party and 90 uninvited guests arrive with an appetite. This immediately elevates the feast from a small colonial affair to a massive, cross-cultural event. The logistical nightmare must have been astounding. The Pilgrims likely supplied what they could, probably some wild-fowl ducks, geese, possibly turkey, though not in the central role we imagine in, fish, shellfish, and the 5 deer mentioned in the account, which the Wampanoag men contributed, a generous, essential contribution that likely saved the Pilgrims from an embarrassing catering shortfall. The menu itself is a quirky or fringe tidbit that completely dismantles the modern vision for get the potatoes. Not common yet. Forget the sweet potato casserole, and definitely forget the cranberry sauce, ours too tart. No sugar yet. Instead, imagine corn porridge, boiled squash, venison that tasted faintly of the forest, and possibly some native, grown beans. It was a dense, caloric life-sustaining meal, but probably quite bland by modern standards. It's a good moment to remind yourself that the iconic, later version of the holiday is a construct of Victorian-era nostalgia, built around this one, highly unusual, 3-day party. Now, as you look around at the scene, you have to understand the underlying tensions and misconceptions that complicate this famous day. The Pilgrims, for all their piety, saw the successful harvest as a sign of divine favor. But they were not necessarily planning a recurring annual event tied to the end of the harvest. They were just celebrating a win. Historians still argue whether the presence and large contribution of the Wampanoag people was a genuine act of peaceful, spontaneous alliance, or a calculated political maneuver by Massasoit designed to assess the strength and intentions of the new settlers and secure a military advantage against rival tribes. The popular narrative paints a picture of simple, harmonious coexistence, but the reality was a complex, tactical diplomatic dance in a high-stakes geopolitical environment. Massasoit was a strategic leader dealing with a fragile, but potentially powerful, new force in his territory, sharing food and military exercises because, yes, the celebration included some mutual displays of shooting and martial skill, was a way of establishing a crucial, if temporary, balance of power. They were not just friends sharing a meal. They were complex nations testing the waters of a new relationship. The lasting consequence of this unscripted meal is its eventual retrofitting into the American national narrative. It became the convenient origin story touchstone, the moment that symbolically bridged the old world and the new, the settler and the native, peace and plenty. But it took centuries to achieve this status. For nearly 200 years, this specific 1621 feast was largely forgotten outside of a few local histories. It wasn't consistently celebrated on an annual basis, even in Plymouth, until the late 17th century, and it certainly wasn't national. When the colonies later did proclaim days of Thanksgiving, they were still event-driven, sporadic, and highly localized, just like before. You move forward a few years and observe a second, more formal day of Thanksgiving in Plymouth, declared in 1623. This one was a true, religious, and somber event, proclaimed after a providential rain ended a severe drought. The emphasis shifted sharply back from secular feasting and diplomacy to solemn religious duty. This is where the colonists' calendar got even more confusing. An informal harvest feast one year, a formal day of prayer the next, and nothing at all the year after that. It was entirely dictated by circumstances. Can you imagine trying to plan travel arrangements for a holiday that might or might not happen depending on the local rainfall? Don't buy your train ticket, Martha. Governor Bradford hasn't seen a large enough fish catch this week to justify a day of gratitude. This initial uncertainty is the most important takeaway from the Plymouth story for our larger narrative of two diverging nations. The holiday was born in ambiguity. It had no fixed date, no set menu, and no national mandate. It was highly flexible, adaptable to local politics, agricultural outcomes, and specific religious needs. It was, in short, a cultural raw material. When the English colonies later broke from the mother country, they didn't inherit a single, unified national Thanksgiving tradition from the Old World, and the 1621 feast, despite its later fame, didn't immediately create one in the New World either. Think of it this way. The Plymouth feast was like an extremely successful, spontaneous garage band rehearsal. Everyone loved it. It sounded great, but no one bothered to sign a contract, book a tour, or set up a regular practice schedule. It took decades of effort by later managers, political leaders, and persistent magazine editors, as you'll soon discover, to turn that single, joyous jam session into a national institution with a fixed date and a recognizable set list. You are standing now in the mid-17th century, and the various North American settlements are rapidly proliferating. From Massachusetts Bay to the Chesapeake, colonies are growing and finding their own local rhythms. Each one is independently deciding when and why they should stop work for a day of communal recognition. This radical decentralization of the calendar meant that, at any given moment, two colonies just a few hundred miles apart might be observing completely different public holidays. One might be celebrating a victory over indigenous people, very grim kind of Thanksgiving, that sadly became common in the 1630s and 40s, while the other might be mourning a poor harvest with a day of fasting. The holiday was not yet a symbol of unity. It was a reflection of fragmented, localized survival and conflict. It's a miracle that any standardization ever happened at all. And it is precisely this initial chaotic, highly localized approach that would later make it easy for two distinct national narratives, one American and one Canadian, to cherry-pick different aspects of the tradition and set their own dates. The 1621 feast was a foundational source, but it was not the blueprint. It was a famous example of a pre-existing cultural practice, the harvest feast, that had a good publicist centuries later. You turn your attention back to the silent, cold ground of Plymouth, realizing that the most beautiful part of this story is how thoroughly the original actors misunderstood their own future significance. The people feasting in 1621 were simply trying to survive. They had no idea they were laying the groundwork for a holiday that would eventually become a flashpoint for international calendar conflict, or that their non-religious harvest meal would become the most sacred origin story of a major global power. Their gift to the future was not a date, but a potent, highly adaptable image of settlers and natives sharing the bounty, surviving the odds. It's an image that has been relentlessly, even brutally, simplified and sanitized, but its power is undeniable. As you walk away from the chilling winds of Plymouth, you're now moving into the period of maximum calendar chaos, the years where everyone was improvising their own celebration, where the very idea of a shared national date seemed utterly impossible. This fragmentation is the essential precondition for the eventual split between the two nations' holidays. You've left the legendary but ambiguous shores of Plymouth and now move into the turbulent 18th century, a time of rapid growth and even more rapid calendar confusion. This is the era of colonial chaos, the search for a cohesive date. You are walking through a patchwork quilt of 13 distinct colonies, each with its own preferred church, its own economic drivers, and crucially, its own ideas about when to be thankful. The period leading up to the Revolutionary War is a masterclass in decentralized governance, and Thanksgiving, far from being a national glue, was an index of this intense regional difference. Imagine trying to mail a letter in this era. You couldn't just say, "Happy Thanksgiving," because the recipient might look at your letter and declare, "Thanksgiving. That happened last month." Now we're in a period of solemn fast and prayer, because the governor is worried about French privateers. Or perhaps they'd say, "Thanksgiving. That's not until the tobacco harvest is fully cured in mid-December." The holiday was essentially held hostage by the whims of local political and religious leaders, colonial governors, and, in self-governing colonies, the legislative assemblies were the sole authority for proclaiming days of public recognition, whether for feasting or fasting. They treated these days like political tools, scheduling them to reinforce civic virtue, thank God for a victory, or unify the populace during a crisis. This flexibility, where the date was constantly shifting, is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. Before the constitutional era, the specific day for a Thanksgiving observance was always a non-fixed date, proclaimed annually or sporadically by colonial governors or legislative bodies in response to specific events, not tied to a calendar month. You're traversing the colonies now, noticing the distinct flavors of gratitude. In Puritan New England, you still see the heaviest religious emphasis. Thanksgiving proclamations here were often verbose, laden with moral judgment, and centered on divine providence and adherence to religious law. The feast was a spiritual reward for a life of righteousness. Then you move south to Virginia, where the established Anglican Church held sway, and the observances were generally less frequent and less severe. Gratitude here might be expressed more through balls, banquets, and general expressions of local prosperity. A sort of relaxed, agricultural abundance celebration, decidedly less heavy on the fire and brimstone sermons. Further south in the Carolinas, the observance was even more sporadic, often overshadowed by the sheer difficulty of governance and the complexity of the early plantation economy. It's almost as if the closer you got to the equator, the less urgent the need to officially thank God for surviving the winter became, and the more spontaneous the feasting. This regional inconsistency means that if you traveled from Boston to Charleston in the year 1760, you might pass through 5 different colonies that had observed 5 different Thanksgiving dates, or none at all. The very idea of the holiday as a fixed, universal, domestic celebration was non-existent. It was an intermittent civic duty. This is the colonial chaos we're talking about. The move toward national unity forced a slight, temporary change. When the pressure cooker of the Revolution started to heat up, the Continental Congress recognized the power of a shared, unifying ritual. In 1777, during the darkest days of the war, Congress recommended a day of Thanksgiving to the states. This was the first time that a single, centralized authority attempted to coordinate the observance across the colonies, now states. And it was a shrewd political move. The states complied, but note the timing: it was a one-off, crisis-driven event, celebrating the victory at Saratoga. It was an act of political self-assertion, a declaration that their cause had divine support. This act established a precedent for national, unifying proclamations, but it didn't fix a date on the calendar. After the war ended, the authority reverted immediately back to the states, and the chaos resumed. Now, here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the colonial reluctance to fully adopt fixed days. Even amongst the devout, there was sometimes profound opposition to officially decreed holidays. Some radical groups, particularly Baptists and others with dissenting religious views, viewed any government-mandated religious observance, whether a feast or a fast, as a violation of the separation of church and state, a step toward established religion, and thus a return to the tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. They felt that such days should arise purely from the spontaneous will of the people or local churches, not from the pen of a governor or a president. This philosophical resistance acted as a further brake on standardization, contributing to the erratic nature of the holiday schedule. The question of who was proclaiming these days becomes critically important as the colonies transition into independent states. In the post-revolutionary period, state governors frequently continued the practice of proclaiming Thanksgiving, but often on wildly different days. New York might hold theirs in early November, while Pennsylvania might wait until December. This wasn't merely inconvenient. It spoke to the fundamental federalist tension of the new United States. Who has the authority to declare a collective moment of gratitude for the entire citizenry? This is where your first great debate arises. Historians still argue whether the sporadic nature of post-revolutionary Thanksgiving proclamations was primarily due to regional agricultural differences, a practical explanation, or if it was a deliberate, subtle assertion of state sovereignty against the centralizing efforts of the new federal government. A political explanation. It was likely a mix of both, practical necessity layered over a deep-seated suspicion of centralized authority. Remember, You are tracing two diverging timelines, and the fate of the holiday is about to be physically exported, as the American Revolution concludes with a victory for the rebels. A significant portion of the population faces a difficult choice. These are the Loyalists, those who remained faithful to the British Crown. They are not minor players. Estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of the colonial population were Loyalists. When it became clear that the American cause was won, tens of thousands of these individuals, suddenly strangers in their own land, were forced to make a mass exodus. They did not want to live under the new Republican government. And where did many of them go? North, to the remaining British North American territories, primarily modern-day Canada. This is a critical pivot point for our story. When the Loyalists packed their belongings and sailed or walked north, they didn't just take their furniture and their allegiance to the crown. They also took their established cultural practices, including the very specific manner of celebrating Thanksgiving. They took the memory of those occasional, event-driven British-style Thanksgiving proclamations. They physically deposited the colonial version of the tradition, which was still a fluid, event-specific, occasional celebration, onto Canadian soil, and critically, they took it before the holiday became fixed and universally adopted in the United States. So, the tradition that arrived in Canada was a direct, authentic 18th century colonial American tradition, complete with its characteristic flexibility and religious underpinnings. This mass movement of people, this Loyalist Exodus, is the geographical and cultural catalyst for the two diverging dates. You can almost see the ragged convoys moving north, the families making the agonizing journey from places like New York and Boston up toward Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would become Upper Canada's Ontario. They are bringing the practice of Thanksgiving, not as a mandatory fixed holiday, but as a concept where the sovereign, or their representative, the governor, proclaims a day of thanks for military success, a royal event, or general prosperity. This is the seed of the Canadian Thanksgiving. When it lands in Canada, it becomes a British North American tradition, tying its legitimacy not to the Pilgrim myth, but to the authority of the Crown and the specific, local needs of the loyal communities in their new, harsh environment. By the time the American government, under President George Washington, finally attempts a true national proclamation, which is the subject of the next section, the tradition in the North is already taking root, transplanted and nurtured under a different political allegiance. The chaos of the American colonial calendar, ironically, enabled the Canadian one to begin its existence. The American refusal to standardize the date during the colonial period meant that the Loyalists left with a tradition that was still perfectly adaptable, flexible enough to later attach itself to different, distinctly British North American markers, rather than the eventually standardized American November ritual. You see now that the differing dates are not just a matter of two countries picking different Thursdays. They are a deep, historical reflection of the political schism of 1783, where one group chose republicanism and the other monarchy, carrying their flexible holiday with them as cultural baggage. You've tracked the chaotic, unscripted origins of the harvest feast and witnessed the physical transport of this erratic tradition northward with the Loyalist Exodus. Now you follow the Loyalists themselves, a disheartened but determined group. as they abandon their homes in the newly formed United States and settle in what remains of British North America. This is the story of the Loyalist Exodus, the Great Migration and Northern Shift, a mass movement that deposited the cultural DNA for a distinct Canadian Thanksgiving tradition. Imagine the sheer scale of the displacement. You are one of these Loyalists, your identity tied to the British Crown, suddenly in exile. You face a journey of immense hardship, moving north through forests and over water to places like Nova Scotia, the newly created New Brunswick, and eventually the interior of Upper Canada. You are not celebrating religious freedom, you are celebrating political fidelity. Your Thanksgiving tradition, the occasional event-driven proclamation from a benevolent governor, becomes a deeply important anchor, a cultural thread tying you back to the crown you risked everything for. The arrival of these tens of thousands of Loyalists fundamentally altered the demographic and political landscape of British North America. Before 1783, the British presence in what is now Canada was relatively small, concentrated primarily in coastal areas like Halifax, and primarily French in Quebec. The Loyalists, known in Canadian history as the United Empire Loyalists, brought with them an English-speaking, Protestant, and deeply conservative culture that insisted on British institutions and customs. This influx is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. The mass migration of approximately 40,000 to 50,000 Loyalists following the American Revolution established a substantial, politically influential English-speaking population in British North America, which became the cultural and political foundation for modern Canada. When they arrived, they didn't institute a fixed-date holiday. Instead, they reproduced the system they had known in the colony as the governor, representing the king, would proclaim a day of thanksgiving. This was often tied to successful military outcomes, or more frequently, to expressions of royal benevolence, like the king recovering from an illness or a major naval victory far across the Atlantic. Crucially, the holiday, when proclaimed, became a public demonstration of their loyalty, a way of differentiating themselves from the rebellious Republican Americans to the South. Their gratitude was political as well as spiritual. Now, pause and think about the geography, which plays a subtle but essential role. The new Loyalist settlements in Nova Scotia and Upper Canada had a much shorter and more precarious growing season than the mid-Atlantic colonies. The harvest came earlier, was less certain, and the threat of an early winter was far more pressing. This practical reality of a shorter agricultural window naturally pushed any genuine harvest celebration toward an earlier date on the calendar, typically into October. It's a quiet, agricultural logic that begins to distinguish the Northern tradition, while the American focus would eventually drift toward the end of November, coinciding with a time when most farmers were long done with the fieldwork. The Canadian tradition had a natural pull toward the actual moment of successful completion of the vital, life-sustaining harvest. You observe the early, sporadic Canadian Thanksgivings. They are often solemn. One of the very first post-Loyalist observances was in Nova Scotia in 1799, proclaiming a day of public thanksgiving for Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory over the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. It was a purely imperial, event-driven celebration, demonstrating that the holiday was now firmly connected to the fate of the British Empire. not the harvest cycle of the North American continent. This connection to imperial events, a quirky or fringe tidbit, would persist for decades, with Canadian Thanksgiving often aligning with milestone birthdays of the monarch or the culmination of a military campaign. It's a reminder that, in the North, the concept of gratitude was profoundly political and connected to an overseas sovereign, a completely different philosophical foundation than the American one rooted in Puritan piety and Pilgrim survival. This divergence created a significant cultural distance. The new American Republic, in its attempts to forge a unique identity, would increasingly lean on the domestic story of the Pilgrims. Meanwhile, British North America, desperate to assert its non-Republican identity, embraced a tradition where the holiday was a ceremonial act of the Crown's representative. This meant that the date could, and often did, bounce wildly around the calendar in the northern colonies, from June to November, depending on what important royal or military event needed celebrating. The flexibility that the Loyalists brought with them was maintained, even reinforced by the political need to signal alignment with London. Now, we come to the scholarly debate that underpins this whole cultural shift. Historians still argue whether the Canadian Thanksgiving tradition, initially transplanted by the Loyalists, owes its core cultural identity more to the specific memory of the Loyalist political exile and commitment to monarchy, or if it is simply the natural, inevitable evolution of a harvest festival in a northern, resource-constrained climate. Was it primarily an act of political self-definition or an act of geographical necessity? The answer matters, because if it was political, the October date is merely a coincidence. If it was geographical, the October date was always inevitable, regardless of the king. Think of it like this: the American Thanksgiving was a tradition searching for a permanent, unifying date. The Canadian tradition was a political, religious ceremony searching for a reason to be proclaimed. When the northern tradition finally coalesced, it was less about establishing a national myth of origin and more about the logistics of community and the affirmation of allegiance. You see the two streams of tradition now, distinctly separated by a hard-fought border and a chasm of political ideology. South of the line, the newly minted Americans are struggling with a nascent federal government that is trying, and largely failing, to fix the holiday's date, as you will see in the next section. North of the line, the Loyalists are celebrating a British tradition, administered by royal representatives and celebrated on a revolving, non-fixed schedule that often coincides with an early northern harvest. The tradition that took root in Canada was essentially a time capsule of the pre-revolutionary colonial practice, flexible, event-driven, and monarchical. The American tradition would evolve into something rigid, fixed, and republican. It is a perfect historical echo: two nations, born of the same European customs, separated by a revolution, and taking two different paths to calendar conformity. The seed of the difference was planted in 1783, when the Loyalists chose their new home and took their flexible, British-aligned tradition with them. You have seen the Thanksgiving tradition break apart and travel north with the Loyalists. Now, you return your gaze south to the fledgling United States, where the new government, fresh from its victory, but struggling with internal divisions, is attempting to create a unified national holiday. This is the moment of presidential proclamations Washington's fleeting federal fix, where the authority of the highest office is used, briefly and unsuccessfully, to standardize gratitude. You are standing in the political epicenter of the new republic, watching the machinery of the first federal government grind into motion. The Founding Fathers understood that new nations need unifying myths and rituals, and Thanksgiving, with its deep religious and civic roots, was a natural candidate. In 1789, a few months after his inauguration, President George Washington issued the very first Thanksgiving Proclamation under the new Constitution. This is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. In 1789, President George Washington proclaimed a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed on Thursday, November 26th, marking the first nationwide Thanksgiving under the U.S. Constitution. This day was explicitly set aside to thank God for the successful conclusion of the War of Independence and the establishment of the new form of government. Washington's proclamation was a landmark effort to inject a sense of national unity into a deeply fragmented political landscape. He was using the holiday as a tool of federalization, declaring that this day of gratitude should be observed by all citizens. You can imagine the impact. A directive coming from the highest office, encouraging shared celebration. However, as quickly as it appeared, the federal fix fizzled. Subsequent presidential proclamations were sporadic. John Adams, the second president, issued Thanksgiving proclamations in 1798 and 1799, but Thomas Jefferson, the third president, flatly refused to issue any. Jefferson's refusal is a crucial part of this history, rooted in the very philosophical resistance you touched upon earlier. He viewed the presidential proclamation of a religious holiday as a potentially dangerous precedent, an unconstitutional mixing of church and state. He believed that such observances should be left strictly to the states and local churches. This philosophical stand acted as a massive historical roadblock. For nearly 4 decades after Jefferson's initial refusal in 1801, no subsequent president attempted to issue an annual National Thanksgiving Proclamation. The idea of a federally mandated date was dead in the water. This presidential reluctance meant that the chaos of the colonial era simply transferred its authority to the state level. Throughout the early 19th century, Thanksgiving continued to be celebrated, but only because state governors in places like Massachusetts and New York kept up the annual tradition. The states acted as the guardians of the holiday, each one selecting its own date, resulting in the chaotic, highly localized calendar schedule we saw before. You might travel from Massachusetts, celebrating in late November, down to Pennsylvania, often celebrating in early December, and then across to the Western Territories, where it was often not celebrated at all, and find the holiday calendar entirely inconsistent. This continued inconsistency, despite Washington's brief attempt at standardization, is the key to understanding why the date remained fluid for so long. The federal authority had been decisively rejected. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the growing regional differences during the early 1800s. As the northern states cemented their annual late November Thanksgiving tradition, the holiday gained significant traction as a powerful cultural marker. However, in the burgeoning southern states, the holiday was often either ignored or actively dismissed. The reasons were complex, but they included the Anglican Church's preference for fixed holy days over spontaneous Thanksgivings, and a focus on different agricultural cycles. More importantly, Southern political and cultural leaders often viewed the holiday as an inherently Yankee or Puritan institution, an unwelcome cultural import from the very states they were increasingly in political tension with. They weren't rejecting the idea of gratitude. They were rejecting the specific Northern ritual of expressing it. This regional divide, where the North celebrated a recurring Thanksgiving and the South largely did not, would become a crucial fault line leading up to the Civil War. This is the central scholarly debate of this era. Historians still argue whether Jefferson's refusal to proclaim Thanksgiving was primarily a principled stance on the separation of church and state, or if it was a political calculation designed to appease the anti-federalist states' rights sentiment that was strongest in the southern and western states. Was he a champion of constitutional liberty, or a shrewd politician recognizing that a national religious holiday would only alienate a significant portion of his political base? The effect, regardless of the intent, was to halt the nationalization of the holiday for decades, allowing the tradition in Canada, which we discussed in the last section, to develop without the competition of a fixed, universally recognized American date. Meanwhile, north of the border, the tradition is still in its flexible, royalist phase. The Governor-General of British North America continues to proclaim occasional days of Thanksgiving, usually tied to a great event in the life of the British Empire. You are simultaneously observing an American government that is too fearful of centralized authority to fix a date, and a Canadian government that is too centralized severs, via the monarchy, to need a fixed date, content instead to simply wait for the next imperial victory to celebrate. The legacy of Washington's attempt is that it established the precedent that the president could proclaim a national Thanksgiving, but it emphatically failed to establish the tradition that the president must proclaim it annually or that it must fall on a fixed date. This failure of federal authority in the early republic is what created the historical vacuum that a determined civilian, a magazine editor, no less, who you will meet later, would eventually fill. You stand at the turn of the 19th century, recognizing that the lack of a standardized American date is not an accident. It is the direct consequence of the era's deep-seated political philosophy about limited federal power. This political inertia is what allowed the holiday to remain a fragmented, regional, and heavily partisan celebration. It means that when the next great conflict arrives, the War of 1812, the two nations on the continent will enter the war with no shared, unifying annual tradition. The War of 1812 will act as a final, definitive wedge, ensuring that when the holiday is eventually standardized in both nations, they will select different dates, symbolizing their hardened, separate identities. The inability to settle on a Thanksgiving date during this period reflects the fundamental instability of the early American experiment itself. You have just witnessed the political inertia in the United States, where the fear of federal overreach strangled the attempts to fix a national Thanksgiving date. Meanwhile, north of the border, the tradition remains flexible and tied to the crown. Now, you step into the next major conflict that would permanently cement the cultural and calendar differences. The War of 1812's echo, defining two cultures. This conflict, often called the Forgotten War, was anything but forgettable for the people living along the vast shared border, and it profoundly shaped the identity of both nations, subtly influencing their future, diverging holiday calendars. Imagine the atmosphere along the frontier from 1812 to 1815. It is a period of intense, localized conflict, national pride, and deep-seated mutual suspicion. For the United States, the war, despite its mixed results, solidified the concept of American independence against the old colonial power, fostering a sense of national unity that transcended earlier state rivalries. For the residents of British North America, future Canada, the successful defense against the American invasions became a defining, heroic national narrative. It wasn't just a military conflict. It was an identity forge. They proved their loyalty to the crown and their capacity to defend their territory, fundamentally differentiating themselves from the aggressive Republican neighbor to the south. This redefining of identities is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. The War of 1812 solidified separate, often antagonistic, national identities in the United States and British North America, leading to a profound cultural distinction that reinforced the separation of their civic and celebratory calendars. The people on both sides of the border had a new, shared experience of fighting one another, making the notion of a single, shared holiday date less culturally desirable. As the war concluded, both sides proclaimed their own days of gratitude, but with different political and religious coloring. In the United States, James Madison, who was forced to flee the White House when the British burned it, proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving in 1815 to mark the return of peace and the preservation of the Republic. This proclamation, like Washington's before it, was a one-off, event-driven political act. It did not create an annual tradition, nor did it fix a date. It simply confirmed that the holiday, when proclaimed nationally, was now directly linked to the health and success of the American Republic. North of the border, in the various British North American colonies, governors and the Governor-General also proclaimed days of thanksgiving and celebration, but these were explicitly tied to the successful defense of the territories and the continued protection afforded by the British Empire. They were celebrating a victory against the Americans, which naturally put their expression of gratitude on an entirely different emotional and political footing. Their thanksgiving was an affirmation of their continued status as British subjects. This era of conflict introduced a quirky or fringe tidbit into the historical record. The American tradition, rooted in the Pilgrims, was largely a celebration of survival and abundance. The Canadian tradition, post-1812, often carried a faint, but persistent, note of relief and defense. You see records of Thanksgiving sermons in Upper Canada that explicitly reference the routing of American invaders, framing the harvest abundance as proof of God's favor on the Loyalist cause. It was a thanksgiving mixed with a victory celebration, which subtly pushed the holiday's meaning away from the purely agricultural focus. It's like having a birthday party, but half the guests are also celebrating the fact that they successfully beat up the neighbor who tried to crash the last one. The period immediately following 1815 saw the continued, frustrating calendar chaos in the United States. Without presidential guidance, the states reverted entirely to their own systems. Most northern states settled on an annual, late November date, turning Thanksgiving into a regional phenomenon. that was often ignored or actively disliked in the South. This growing sectionalization of the holiday made it a divisive cultural marker, not a unifying one. Meanwhile, the various British North American provinces, soon to move toward confederation, continued their occasional, imperial-focused celebrations. The practice of tying Thanksgiving to a specific event, a royal birthday, a victory, or a peace treaty, persisted well into the mid-19th century. This flexibility was institutionalized. When they did observe a harvest Thanksgiving, the earlier agricultural cycle, in places like Nova Scotia and Quebec, meant that the date naturally tended toward October, before the first heavy snowfalls. This brings us to the core scholarly debate that this period crystallizes. Historians still argue whether the post-1815 hardening of national identity simply reinforced pre-existing regional preferences for the holiday date, or if the lingering political animosity between the two nations actively prevented any future effort to harmonize the date and share the tradition. Did the War of 1812 merely formalize an existing separation, or did the animosity itself become the active agent that drove the calendars apart? The effect was the same. The calendar dates for gratitude remained stubbornly separate. You are watching the two traditions drift. The American Thanksgiving is becoming fixed by convention in late November in the North, driven by state governors and a growing sense of regional tradition, completely unconcerned with what's happening federally. The Canadian version, in what will become the Dominion of Canada, is flexible, event-driven, and focused on demonstrating imperial loyalty, often landing in early October or even earlier, dictated by a far-off sovereign's calendar. The lack of a unified American date, caused by the early presidential timidity, now becomes an international marker. The two nations are defining themselves against one another, and their respective days of gratitude are becoming symbols of their different political philosophies. Republicanism versus monarchy, continental origin myth versus imperial loyalty. The War of 1812 did not set the dates, but it made the eventual adoption of different fixed dates a near certainty. It created the permanent cultural boundary line that no amount of shared history could erase. You realize that from this point forward, the history of Thanksgiving is no longer about one tradition, but two parallel and increasingly distant legislative journeys toward calendar permanence. The Canadian journey is about to pick up steam. You have seen the American tradition stall, paralyzed by the fear of centralized power, while the Canadian version remained a flexible, event-driven salute to the crown. Now, we turn fully north to British North America, where the scattered colonies are beginning to coalesce into the Dominion of Canada. This is the period of Canadian cornucopia, establishing the Dominion's official date, a story where political expediency and imperial symbolism finally lead to the codification of a fixed, earlier date. The journey toward a fixed date in Canada was less about a persistent magazine editor's "we'll get to her later," and more about parliamentary action and royal connection. For decades after the War of 1812, the various provinces continued their sporadic Thanksgiving practices. A fixed date, however, became desirable after Confederation in 1867. The creation of the Dominion of Canada necessitated a new set of national rituals that could bind the disparate provinces, from the Maritimes to the developing West, into a cohesive national unit, distinct from the United States. The first national, specific Thanksgiving was proclaimed in 1872 by the Canadian Parliament and Governor-General Lord Dufferin. This is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. The first Dominion-wide annual Thanksgiving in Canada was proclaimed in 1872, celebrating the recovery of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VI, from a serious illness, symbolically linking the holiday to the health and continuity of the British monarchy. This was the first attempt at a unifying Canadian holiday that went beyond a local harvest or a specific military victory. Notice the foundation of the celebration. It's not the Pilgrims. It's not the American Revolution. It's the monarchy. The Canadian Thanksgiving was fundamentally a political and imperial holiday, expressing loyalty and collective gratitude for the continuity of the crown, often mixed with a harvest celebration, but with the political purpose taking precedence. This political purpose explains the chaotic flexibility in the early dates. Initially, even after 1872, the date continued to shift wildly. Over the next 2 decades, the Canadian Thanksgiving was observed in November, late October, and even bizarrely in January. It was sometimes tied to the official celebration of Queen Victoria's Golden or Diamond Jubilees, or to successful harvests in different regions. The Canadian government was treating the holiday like a cultural Swiss Army knife, deploying it whenever a moment of collective patriotism or gratitude was needed. This erratic scheduling created administrative headaches, particularly for banks and post offices. This logistical problem is where the date began to naturally drift away from the American late November slot. By the late 19th century, the Canadian celebrations began to cluster primarily in the month of October. The reason for this clustering provides a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Canadian Thanksgiving was frequently observed on a Monday, and often coincided with the Canadian militia's annual call out and training days. In the late 1870s and 1880s, the official proclamation sometimes designated the day for both Thanksgiving and a general muster of the militia. This combination highlights the holiday's civic, non-pilgrim foundation. It was a day of national gratitude and also a day for military preparedness, ensuring the new nation could thank God for its bounty and practice defending it from, well, you know who. The need to hold militia musters before the heavy winter snows, which could lock down large parts of the country by November, pushed the whole civic calendar, including Thanksgiving, firmly into the earlier autumn. The final, decisive step toward calendar permanence occurred in the 20th century. For a period, the Canadian Thanksgiving was actually twinned with the observation of Armistice Day, now Remembrance Day, on November 11th. From 1921 to 1930, the two holidays were celebrated together on the Monday of the week of November 11th. Imagine trying to shift emotional gears from solemn national mourning to joyful feasting in the span of an afternoon. It was, perhaps predictably, a cultural and logistical mess. The solemnity of remembering the dead did not mix well with the joy of the harvest. This brings us to the core scholarly debate of the Canadian process. Historians still argue whether the Canadian government's eventual decision to legally fix the date on the second Monday in October in 1957 was driven primarily by the need to separate the holiday from the solemnity of Remembrance Day, political, cultural reason, or if it was simply a pragmatic choice to align the celebration with the average successful conclusion of the actual agricultural harvest across the country. A purely logistical reason. Was it a matter of respect for veterans or a matter of respecting the growing season? Ultimately, in 1957, the Canadian Parliament formally cemented the date, issuing a proclamation that fixed it permanently. A day of general thanksgiving to Almighty God for the bountiful harvest with which Canada has been blessed, to be observed on the second Monday in October. By fixing the date to a Monday, it created the popular three-day weekend that the country now celebrates, a distinct feature of the Northern holiday calendar. You can now see the Canadian process was methodical, parliamentary, and tied to both imperial loyalty and pragmatic logistics, driven by an earlier, harsher northern climate. It had almost nothing to do with the specific myth of the Pilgrims. While the American holiday was about to be fixed by a presidential decree rooted in a civil war, the Canadian date was fixed by an act of Parliament, rooted in the desire for a cohesive national identity and the need to separate a day of feasting from a day of solemn remembrance. The two nations, starting from the same chaotic colonial traditions, had now decisively chosen different paths, one driven by political schism and a persistent editor, and the other by parliamentary order and a short growing season. The stage is set for the final, permanent divergence. You have observed the Canadian journey toward a fixed date. A methodical, parliamentary process driven by imperial loyalty and geographical necessity. Now you return to the United States, where the holiday is still a patchwork of regional dates, a situation that had persisted for decades, largely due to political resistance. This narrative shifts to a single, determined individual who almost single-handedly willed the American holiday into existence. Sarah Josepha Hale, the woman who willed Thanksgiving. Imagine a woman with a quill pen and an unshakable sense of civic mission. This is Sarah Josepha Hale, the influential editor of Godey's Lady's Book, one of the most widely read magazines of the 19th century. Hale was not a politician or a religious leader. She was a cultural arbiter who recognized the profound need for a unifying national holiday in a deeply divided country. She saw Thanksgiving, with its focus on home, family, and harvest, as the perfect antidote to the country's toxic sectional rivalries. Starting in 1846, Hale launched a relentless 20-year campaign to establish a permanent National Thanksgiving Day, to be observed on the same date throughout the entire United States. This is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. Sarah Josepha Hale spent over 2 decades writing editorials, publishing recipes, and sending thousands of letters to 5 sitting U.S. presidents, governors, and other influential figures, advocating for a fixed national Thanksgiving holiday. Her persistence is legendary in the history of American civic ritual. She was essentially the holiday's most effective publicist, using the massive circulation of Godey's Lady's Book to spread the specific, now familiar iconography of the Thanksgiving feast: the roasted turkey, the stuffing, the pumpkin pie. She wasn't just advocating for a date, she was constructing a national domestic ritual. In a time of increasing industrialization and social upheaval, she promoted Thanksgiving as a day of return, a celebration of hearth and home, designed to heal the widening cultural rift between the industrial North and the agrarian South. Her vision, however, ran headlong into the same states' rights argument that had stopped Washington and Jefferson. She wrote to President Zachary Taylor, who agreed with the sentiment, but felt it was a matter for the states. She wrote to subsequent presidents and governors, and while the idea slowly gained traction, with more states adopting an annual, fixed day, the national goal remained elusive. The holiday was stuck in a legislative stalemate. The federal government refused to set the date, and the states couldn't agree on a uniform one. This period of her campaign reveals a quirky or fringe tidbit. Hale meticulously promoted a late November date, specifically the last Thursday, not necessarily for any deep religious reason, but because in most northern states, the major farm work was unquestionably complete by then. More importantly, she needed a date that wouldn't interfere with Christmas preparations or the busy social season, positioning Thanksgiving as a distinct, preceding domestic holiday. She was a master of calendar logistics, carving out a specific cultural slot for her invented tradition. The persistence of the states' rights argument forms the central scholarly debate of this era. Historians still argue whether Hale's long campaign ultimately succeeded because she genuinely convinced the nation of the holiday's moral necessity, or if the nationalization of Thanksgiving only became politically possible when the federal government gained unprecedented authority during the Civil War. Was it a victory for cultural influence, or a function of political necessity? The answer lies in the ultimate timing of her success. Hale's efforts might have continued indefinitely if not for the eruption of the American Civil War in 1861. The war, a bloody and existential conflict, provided the political context needed to overcome the states' rights barrier. The Union government, in its desperate effort to maintain morale and unify the disparate northern and western states under a single banner, needed rituals that affirmed the continuity and divine favor of the Union cause. It was into this volatile, war-torn atmosphere that Hale sent her final, most urgent letter in September 1863, directly to President Abraham Lincoln. She appealed to him not on the grounds of tradition or piety alone, but on the grounds of national unity and war-time morale. She argued that a national day of common gratitude could help bind the weary populace together and serve as a powerful symbolic assertion of federal authority. You can feel the weight of this moment. The letter lands on Lincoln's desk in the aftermath of the devastating but decisive Battle of Gettysburg and the successful siege of Vicksburg. The tides of war are turning, and Lincoln is acutely aware of the need to provide a sense of collective purpose and hope. He sees in Hale's proposal a perfect opportunity to use the holiday as a political tool. The American calendar is about to be fixed, not by tradition, but by the necessities of total war. You move now to the decisive moment of fixation, the point of no return for the American calendar. You have followed Sarah Josepha Hale's tireless campaign, a civilian effort that finally converged with the intense political gravity of the American Civil War. You stand at the decisive moment in 1863, when the fractured American calendar is about to be fixed, not by tradition, but by the necessity of national survival. This is the story of Lincoln's legacy Civil War and the permanent calendar marker. In September 1863, amid the agonizing reality of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln received Hale's persuasive letter. The Union had just secured pivotal victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but the cost in human life was devastating, and morale needed a powerful boost. Lincoln, a master of symbolic and moral leadership, immediately recognized the profound value of a unified day of gratitude, a civic ritual that transcended regional divisions and affirmed the Union's purpose under divine providence. On October 3, 1863, President Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring a national day of thanksgiving. This is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. President Abraham Lincoln's 1863 proclamation, issued during the Civil War, established the tradition of an annual national Thanksgiving to be observed on the last Thursday of November. This proclamation was a watershed moment, finally taking the holiday out of the hands of state governors and permanently cementing its status as a federal, national event. Notice the timing, the last Thursday of November. Lincoln's choice of the date was practical and conventional, aligning with the late November tradition that had already been established by custom in the northern states for decades. By adopting the northern custom, Lincoln was essentially using the holiday to assert the cultural dominance of the Union cause. The holiday became a political tool, a symbolic assertion that the Union was whole and blessed. For the next 7 years, from 1863 onward, presidents followed Lincoln's precedent, proclaiming Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. The date, set during a national crisis, was now fixed by presidential custom. But the history of the date has a quirky or fringe tidbit tied directly to Lincoln's legacy. It wasn't until the Republican Party adopted the annual proclamation as a key tradition that it truly became permanent. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, and then President Ulysses S. Grant, continued the annual proclamation, solidifying the idea that the president must declare Thanksgiving every year. The holiday became indelibly associated with the Republican commitment to national unity and federal power, differentiating it further from the southern states, which only slowly and reluctantly adopted the holiday after the war. For a time, Thanksgiving was a distinctly Union holiday, a celebration of the North's vision of the country. The establishment of this annual date now made the contrast with the Canadian practice even sharper. North of the border, the celebrations were still sporadic and tied to the crown, shifting from October to November to January, depending on the relevant royal event. But the American Thanksgiving now had a fixed calendar anchor: the last Thursday of November, a date utterly divorced from the practicalities of the Canadian harvest cycle, which was already over and often snow-covered by that point. The Civil War had created a national holiday based on political and cultural unity, not agricultural reality. This leads directly to the core scholarly debate of this era. Historians still argue whether Lincoln's 1863 proclamation, while successful in fixing the date, fundamentally altered the holiday's core meaning, shifting it permanently from a primarily religious and harvest-focused observance to a primarily civic and nationalistic celebration of American destiny. Did the necessities of war effectively replace piety with patriotism as the central theme of the day? You realize that Lincoln's act was both a final capstone to Hale's decades-long effort and a decisive separation from the Canadian tradition. The American holiday now had a strong origin myth, the Pilgrims, and a decisive political moment of fixation, the Civil War. The Canadian equivalent, still tied to the crown and lacking a singular, dramatic founding moment, would continue its legislative evolution for nearly another century. The permanent selection of late November in the U.S. meant that when Canada finally fixed its date, it would have to make a distinct choice to avoid alignment. Had the U.S. not fixed its date in 1863, or had it chosen a September or October date are more common in some earlier colonial proclamations, the two countries might have eventually converged on the same holiday. Instead, the necessities of the Civil War created a fixed calendar marker that was politically and climatically unsuitable for their northern neighbor. You see the American calendar firm up around this single date, reflecting a profound commitment to a centralized government and a unified national narrative. It is a powerful legacy of the Civil War, a gentle, domestic ritual born from a brutal conflict. The date is set, the custom is established, and for the next 75 years, the last Thursday in November remains the immutable American tradition, setting the stage for the final, minor calendar adjustment that would make the separation final and official. You have traced the American holiday to its fixed position, the last Thursday in November, solidified by Civil War necessity, and the Canadian tradition to its flexible imperial origins. This final section covers mid-20th century tweaks, a calendar's final tug of war, which saw both nations make the small, final legislative adjustments that cemented their distinct dates and finalized the calendar separation you've been following. For 75 years after Lincoln's proclamation, the American Thanksgiving was, by custom, celebrated on the last Thursday of November. However, this established tradition ran into an entirely new, modern challenge: economics. In the late 1930s, the Great Depression was still looming, and retailers were acutely aware of the short holiday shopping season. When the month of November contained 5 Thursdays, the holiday landed on the very last day, leaving only a small window between Thanksgiving and Christmas for shopping, a crucial period for the struggling economy. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, responding to pressure from the National Retail Dry Goods Association and keen to stimulate the economy, decided to move Thanksgiving a week earlier, to the second to last Thursday of November. This is your first mainstream historical fact for this section. President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the American Thanksgiving date from the last Thursday to the fourth Thursday in 1939 to extend the Christmas shopping season during the Great Depression. This seemingly minor calendar tweak caused absolute chaos and widespread public backlash. Imagine the administrative nightmare: schools, businesses, and even college football schedules had been set for the traditional last Thursday. Suddenly, the country was split, with some states observing Franksgiving, as it was derisively nicknamed, linking the change to FDR on the earlier date, and others sticking to the traditional Thanksgiving on the last Thursday. You had families whose loyalties were divided, with some members traveling for the new date and others for the old. This cultural split persisted for 2 years. It was like trying to implement a new operating system across an entire country simultaneously, but only half the population agreed to download the update. This period of confusion led to the final legislative solution. By 1941, it was clear that the split dates were unsustainable. Congress acted to end the confusion, legislatively mandating a fixed, permanent date. In December 1941, Congress passed a joint resolution declaring that Thanksgiving would be celebrated annually on the fourth Thursday of November. This resolution settled the American date for good, removing the power of the president to unilaterally change it, and finally resolving the 3-century-long struggle for a fixed date. The American holiday was now permanently anchored to the fourth Thursday, slightly earlier than the last Thursday in most years, ensuring a maximum 5-week shopping period before Christmas. Meanwhile, north of the border, the Canadian holiday was on its own, independent trajectory. We last saw it oscillating across the calendar, sometimes combined with armistice days, November 11th Eid, a disastrous pairing of celebration and solemnity. This peculiar combination provides a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Canadian Parliament finally moved to separate the two occasions because veterans groups heavily lobbied against the holiday atmosphere intruding upon the sacred nature of Remembrance Day. The desire to respectfully commemorate the Great War dead was a major non-agricultural, non-imperial factor, pushing Thanksgiving to a different, earlier spot on the calendar. The final Canadian act of fixation occurred in 1957. The Canadian Parliament issued a proclamation to officially fix Thanksgiving on the second Monday in October. This legislative act was the final, formal calendar separation. The choice of the second Monday gave the nation its now familiar 3-day-long weekend, a pragmatic choice that maximized tourism and family visits, and it firmly positioned the holiday in early autumn, aligning it with the true peak of the northern harvest, long before the cold and snow typically set in. This brings us to the final, quiet realization of your journey and the core scholarly debate that binds these two histories. Historians still argue whether the Canadian choice of the second Monday in October was a deliberate, final cultural differentiation from the United States' late November tradition, or if the selection was purely an independent, pragmatic decision based on geography and the need to create a 3-day weekend. In other words, did the Canadians actively choose not to be American, or did their geography and legislative needs simply land them on a different date? Regardless of the intent, the effect was the same. The calendar chasm was finalized. You can now see the two parallel timelines concluding. The American Thanksgiving is a late autumn holiday, solidified by war and ultimately adjusted for commerce with its roots in the Pilgrim myth. The Canadian Thanksgiving is an early autumn holiday, solidified by parliamentary order and separated from imperial events and solemn remembrance, with its roots in Loyalist fidelity and northern geography. Both started from the same chaotic, colonial, flexible tradition of gratitude, but the forces of revolution, geography, commerce, and war acted as historical levers, gently pushing the two calendars apart until they were a full month separated. You are standing at the end of this historical narrative, looking at two fixed points, the American fourth Thursday in November and the Canadian second Monday in October. You realize the differing dates are not an arbitrary mistake or a simple oversight. They are a profound, subtle, and permanent record of the divergent histories of North America, one born of revolution and civil war, the other defined by loyalty and geographic practicality. The journey is complete. You have successfully navigated the 3 centuries of confusion, chaos, and presidential proclamations that resulted in 2 excellent holidays on 2 very different days. Now, as the last of the historical noise fades, you feel the comfort of the familiar room again. Now, the light in the room is fading completely, and the sounds of the historical narrative are softening to a whisper. You can let go of the names, the dates, the proclamations, and the subtle political maneuvers of centuries past. That great, long journey from the chaotic colonial feasts to the fixed national days has drawn to a gentle close. You no longer need to hold the weight of presidential decrees or parliamentary acts in your mind. The work is done. Allow your eyes to drift shut, the final images of maps and monarchs and determined magazine editors dissolving behind your eyelids. You are safe now, wrapped in the comforting silence of the present. Feel the soft, persistent pressure of the blanket, the cool air touching your skin, and the distant, rhythmic hum of the fan. That low sound is a constant, a simple reassurance that the world is spinning quietly on its axis. The calendar may be settled now, the dates fixed, but your own need for rest is the only constant that truly matters right now. Your breathing slows, growing deeper and more even. Inhale, and then exhale, letting go of every thought, every lingering trace of confusion about which Thursday belonged to which country. The two timelines have separated, and now yours is slowing down to a near stop. It doesn't matter if it's October or November, a Monday or a Thursday. All that matters is this quiet moment, this space of perfect calm. Let your body grow heavy, sinking deeper into the soft support beneath you. Rest now. There is only peace and the promise of a long, deep, and dreamless sleep.